Over. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call this joint meeting of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass Board and the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council to order. My name is Bob Ballou. I have the honor of serving as board chair. This is indeed a joint meeting, and as such we have two co-chairs, myself on behalf of the board and my good friend and colleague to my left, Mike Luisi, on behalf of the council. I have agreed to serve as the primary meeting facilitator for the day, but Mike will have one hand on the wheel at all times and will lead all council votes and weigh in as he sees fit. On behalf of the entire board, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our colleagues on the Mid-Atlantic Council. We meet together at least a couple times every year, but usually as part of a council meeting week and rarely as part of a commission meeting week. So on this rare occasion, it's our pleasure to have you with us here in Arlington. I have just one housekeeping matter, and it happens to pertain to the Rhode Island delegation, and that is to recognize Jason McNamee, who I believe will be, he's in the back right now, but he will be sitting today with the Rhode Island delegation to the board. In accordance with commission policy, when a proxy for an administrative commissioner serves as board chair, which is the case for me, the administrative commissioner may sit with the state's delegation and may advise and consult with the delegation, but may not engage in board discussion, or in this case, board and council discussion. The Rhode Island delegation has decided to avail itself of that opportunity, and for that reason, Jason will be at the table for at least a portion of today's meeting. With that, let's move right into our agenda. The first item on the agenda is the agenda itself. Does anyone on the board or council have any recommended modifications to the agenda? And boy, did my voice just go up a few notches. I'm not sure if that's better or worse. Does anyone on the board or council have any recommended modifications to the agenda? Seeing none, is there any objection to approving the agenda as proposed? Seeing no objection, the agenda as proposed stands approved by consent, and we're on to the next item. And I'm trying to talk softly because I have a feeling this is going out very loudly. The next item is a board-specific item, that is approval of the minutes from the board's meeting on February 8th, 2018. Those meeting materials were provided to the board via email and are posted as part of the meeting materials for today. Are there any recommended modifications to those meeting minutes on the part of the board? Seeing none, is there any objection to approving them as proposed? Seeing none, the minutes stand approved by consent. That brings us to public comment. This is an opportunity for anyone from the public who would like to comment on any issue not on today's agenda to do so. Please be advised that the two primary agenda items for today pertain to commercial summer flounder management, namely federal permit requalification, commercial allocation, and landing flexibility, and recreational black sea bass management, including conservation equivalency, slot limits, and transiting in Block Island Sound. There will be opportunities for public comment on those items once we get to them. Those wishing to comment on any other issue pertaining to summer flounder, scup, or black sea bass, and who signed in on the sheet at the back of the room, which I now have, may do so now. There are no names on the list. Is there anyone from the public who would like to address the board or council on any issue not on today's agenda? I see one hand. Yes, sir. Please come up to the microphone and identify yourself. In fact, I recognize who you are, but Jeff, for the record, please identify yourself. Thank you.
Good morning. Jeff Bross with New Jersey Marine Fisheries. Thank you to both the council and the commission for this opportunity. I was going to do this at the policy board, but I think it's probably a better opportunity to do it now with the council here. As you're all aware, Brandon Muffley took his leave from us. You might say he abandoned us for greener pastures about 18 months ago. Most days, those of us in New Jersey are pretty happy for him, most days, but the struggle's been real for 18 months or so, and so I'm happy to say that things are starting to look a little bit better. I wanted to just make a public service announcement. I wanted to introduce a familiar face to you, but he's sitting in a new seat. He's not in the wrong spot. Recently, Joe Cimino has taken the administrative position for New Jersey's Marine Fisheries. I just wanted, he'll be here all week. He'll be sitting at the table a couple of times for us, but he'll be here all week, and just hopefully you can welcome him back in a new role and offer him either your congratulations or condolences, however you see fit. So thank you very much. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, and welcome, Joe. Nice to have you with us. Would anyone else from the public like to address the council and board at this point? Seeing no hands, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is to consider approval of the draft summer flounder commercial issues public hearing document and draft amendment for public comment. This involves this issue, this action, if you will, it is an action item, involves a single set of management issues. That said, the council and board will be pursuing separate but parallel tracks regarding the development of their respective management documents. The council's track involves a public hearing document, which is up for joint consideration and approval today. The council will then follow up on that at a later date with a draft EIS, a completed draft EIS, which will serve as their full amendment document. The board's track involves just one draft amendment document, which will set forth the exact same set of issues and options that are agreed to by both bodies and contained within the public hearing document and draft EIS, albeit in abbreviated form. If that all sounds a bit confusing, I think it'll become clear as we move through the staff presentations, but I just wanted to note that we've got a couple of, actually we have 3 documents, if you will, a public hearing document, a draft EIS, which is still in the process of being developed, but in its current form, it is available in the council meeting materials, and then a draft amendment, which is the commission document. So they're all intended to align exactly and address the exact same set of issues and alternatives, but I just wanted to note, in case people are flipping around and trying to figure out which document we're on, we're really on one document, a public hearing document that is going to be presented now by staff. So let's move on to that presentation. It'll be given, I believe, in tandem by Kylie Dancy, Fishery Management Specialist with the Council, and Kirby Roots-Murdy, Senior Fishery Management Plan Coordinator with the Commission. Kylie and Kirby, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to run through the presentation, and Kirby is going to be here to interject and jump in if I'm missing anything and getting anything wrong. So we're here to talk about the draft public hearing document for the Summer Flounder Commercial Issues Amendment. And the objectives of today's discussion are to review and approve that draft public hearing document as a joint action. And then, as Bob Ballou already mentioned, the board will consider approving their version of the amendment document as a board-only motion. So this was already covered well, but we have 3 documents associated with this amendment at this point: the joint public hearing document, a commission version of the amendment, which the board needs to approve before public hearings, and a council version of the amendment, which consists of the draft EIS. So the draft EIS is going to include our documentation of the council's compliance with federal laws, so it's going to be a little bit longer and more complex than the other documents. So the board version of the document doesn't need to include all of this analysis that the council's required to do, so it's going to be a little bit more of an abbreviated document, potentially with some additional information added as an appendix later on. So the draft EIS will need to be approved by the council prior to public hearings, and because that requires some more in-depth analysis, that's not complete yet, so we will have hopefully that document reviewed and approved at the June council meeting, but there is no intent to change anything in the amendment at that point in terms of the options presented. Everything is going to be kept consistent with what's discussed today. So in theory, that should be more of a quick discussion, the approval of a draft EIS later on by the council. So to recap quickly the last 2 joint meetings on this amendment, the council and board back in August and December approved a range of alternatives for federal permit requalification criteria, for commercial allocation, and for landings flexibility framework provisions. In addition, this amendment includes proposed revisions to the FMP goals and objectives for summer flounder. These only apply to summer flounder, and they are not final until the council and board approve them. They're not included as an explicit alternative set in this document because they don't really require analysis, but they are in the public hearing document as something for the public to comment on. So I'm not going to go through the whole hearing document itself, but I just wanted to give an overview of what's contained in the document. There's a table of contents and then a comment instructions and public hearing schedule. So the hearing schedule, as you'll notice, it has nothing in it right now. It hasn't been developed yet, and we will be working with states to get those hearings set up once this document is approved. The document also contains a description of the purpose of each of these different alternative sets, and then a section describing federal permit requalification alternatives and impacts, commercial allocation alternatives and impacts, and landings flexibility, framework provisions, alternatives, and impacts. So in terms of the actual content, the key point of the hearing document is that it's intended to be a summary document that has enough description of the actions and their impacts to communicate the proposed action to the public as sort of a standalone document, but also referencing the longer document, which will be the draft EIS. So the public hearing document shouldn't be necessarily too long or go into too much detail, but it should be sufficient to communicate the proposed action to the public. So that additional detail will be found in the draft EIS and in the Commission's amendment document. The current version of the draft EIS with a lot of placeholders is posted as supplemental materials on the Council's website for this meeting, just so Council and board members can see kind of what that is looking like at the moment. The analysis portions will be more substantial as we move toward finalizing that document. The impacts in the hearing document are mostly sort of qualitative and high-level descriptions of potential outcomes of each of the alternatives, with a focus on the socioeconomic impacts, which are clearly going to be the biggest impacts of these proposed actions. So the questions for the Council and Board today are, should this document go to public hearings with the alternatives described here, and does the document adequately communicate the options and their potential impacts to the public? So I'm going to go through an overview of each amendment issue, starting extremely quickly with the FMP goals and objectives, and just a kind of reminder about this. As I mentioned, these proposed revisions were approved for public hearings back in December. They aren't actual alternatives in the document, but they're in Section 4. I'm not going to go through those proposed revisions today, but if you'd like to take a look at them, they're in Section 4 of the public hearing document. And it does note in the document that the Council and Board are seeking comments on those. So that's just a quick reminder about that. And now I'll go through the federal moratorium permit requalification alternatives. So in the document, there's one no action alternative and one action alternative with 7 sub-alternatives for different requalifying criteria for federal moratorium commercial summer flounder permits. So alternative 1A is the current status quo Amendment 2 qualifying criteria of at least 1 pound of summer flounder landed between January 1985 and January 1990. And there are currently 941 eligible moratorium rights under those criteria, although that number does decrease over time. So as some permit holders choose not to keep renewing their permits or don't put it into CPH, confirmation of permit history, that number has decreased over time. So if selecting alternative 1B, which is implement requalifying criteria, the Council and Board would need to choose one of 7 sub-alternatives, which I will go through in this table. So the 7 sub-alternatives are shown here and consist of combinations of different qualifying time periods and landings thresholds. And these are the alternatives that were approved by the Council and Board back in December. So this table includes the number of requalifying and eliminated moratorium rights. I do want to point out here that there's been an update in this analysis in terms of the number of affected permits, or technically speaking, moratorium rights, which is the number associated with a specific moratorium fishing right. So the previous analysis last fall had mistakenly included moratorium rights that had already been canceled, and it also excluded permits in CPH, or confirmation of permit history. So this has been corrected here. It's not a huge impact. So overall, the number of requalifying permits went down in this new analysis, but in practical terms, that doesn't really mean anything because some of the permits that were previously identified as requalifying had already been canceled. So in reality, it would have had no effect on those permits in the first place. So the number of eliminated MRIs did go up somewhat between the two analyses due to the inclusion of permits in CPH, and many of those don't meet the requalifying criteria, so it's a little bit higher in terms of the number of eliminated permits due to the inclusion of those permits. So of the 7 sub-options here, they eliminate a range from between 25% to 55% of the existing moratorium rights. So for the impacts, for each of these kind of alternatives and alternative sets, I want to kind of touch on some of them, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this presentation, so we don't really have time for that. But I do want to kind of go over some general themes of alternatives. So the alternative impacts. So the hearing document contains sort of a general description of possible outcomes, and the draft EIS is going to have some more detail. So in general, for permit requalification alternatives, the extent to which they have an impact depends on, first of all, the likelihood that latent effort vessels will re-enter the fishery, and then the degree to which eliminated permits under Alternative 1B are actually active. So the likelihood that latent effort vessels would re-enter the fishery is extremely difficult to predict. So re-entry to the fishery could be caused by a broad range of management and economic factors, including potentially reallocation discussions that we'll talk about through Alternative Set 2. So overall, the total amount of effort for summer flounder is not expected to be affected by these alternatives because we are still constrained by annual commercial quotas, and because summer flounder is a high demand species, it's likely those quotas are going to be the driving factor behind total effort, not the amount of permits out there. But the Alternative 1B would change the participant pool in theory. This may or may not have any practical impacts, which I'll talk about in a minute, depending on how active those vessels are. So economic impacts are possible to individual permit holders and businesses, both positive impacts for remaining permit holders and negative impacts for eliminated permit holders due to those direct changes in the distribution of access, as well as due to prevention of latent effort re-entering the fishery. So this is a key point, that the magnitude of those impacts is really going to depend on how active the eliminated permits have been and how likely those vessels are to land summer flounder. And based on the table I'll show in the next slide, it seems that for all of these sub-alternatives, there's a very low level of activity that seems to be going on for eliminated permits for summer flounder under these alternatives. So this table is in the hearing document, and it summarizes recent landings and ex-vessel revenues for each combination of eliminated permits under each sub-alternative, and this analysis goes from August 2009 to July 2014. This is the shortest qualifying time frame in the document, and for this analysis, it was kept consistent across all of these sub-options in order to compare apples to apples and be able to see what those look like across all those different options. So this shows total summer flounder landings combined for all of those eliminated permits for each sub-option, along with those associated values. So option 1B2 and 1B4, you'll note that there's no associated landings and revenues. This is not surprising. This is how it should be, given that the qualifying criteria for those options are landed at least 1 pound over this 5-year time period from 2009 to 2014, and option 1B4 is a 10-year qualifying time frame that also includes that last 5-year time frame. So this is how it should be. So the other options are associated with relatively very low landings and revenues, the highest of which is associated with 1B6, which is 181,000 pounds total over that 5 years for all eliminated permits. So as a percentage of the coast-wide summer flounder landings and revenues, which is also shown in this table, you'll see that many of them are extremely small and nothing gets above 0.32%. And in fact, most are much smaller. So in the context of the whole coast, these eliminated permits look like they're landing very small amounts of summer flounder. So it looks like the alternatives in this document are not going to have huge impacts on the distribution of effort among participants, given that there isn't much activity associated with those permits. All right, so I'm going to move on to the commercial allocation options now. So we have 4 commercial allocation alternatives, or 4 broader alternatives, 1 no action and 3 action alternatives, each with 2 sub-alternatives underneath them. So I'll go through each of these in the next few slides, but in summary, they include the no action alternative 2A. Alternative 2B is revised state allocations adjusted based on recent biomass distribution. Alternative 2C includes state allocations that are modified when the annual coastwide quota exceeds a specified trigger. And alternative 2D is the Scup model with 2 coastwide winter quota periods and a state-by-state summer quota period. So a quick note on the precision. I've been asked, there's a lot of tables with a lot of decimal places for allocations in the document. The current state allocations go out to 5 decimal places in the regulations and in the FMP. I haven't been able to track down exactly why that is, other than that, the assumption is that it's probably due to the very small allocation states like New Hampshire. You have to go out several decimal places to get any percentage at all. So the alternatives in this action for state allocations would maintain that level of precision unless we get different guidance from the council and board. So alternative 2A, I'm not going to talk about this much, but just to touch on this, the no action status quo, as you know, is the Amendment 2 from 1993, allocations using a base year of 1980 to 1989 landings history by state. So moving into the options for modifying the allocation, starting with 2B, this option adjusts state allocations using an analysis of the shift in regional relative exploitable biomass from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center trawl survey data. This analysis looks at two regions, a north and a south region, divided approximately at Hudson Canyon, actually using the same survey strata division that we used in the benchmark stock assessment for black sea bass. So this results in a regional split of states from New York North and New Jersey South. So this analysis compares where the relative exploitable biomass was across two time periods, 1980 to 1989, during which time 67% of the exploitable biomass was in the north, and 2007 to 2016, where 80% of the relative exploitable biomass was in the north. So there are two sub-alternatives in the hearing document with different approaches to translating this change into an allocation change. So you'll recall that back in December, staff had recommended including one of these options for public hearings, and the council and board had requested some additional commercial working group guidance on the configuration of this option. So the working group met in February, and there's a summary of that call in your briefing materials. And the working group recommended, in short, that two sub-options be taken to public hearings. Both of these are mathematically appropriate, but they have somewhat different underlying policy intents because they have different levels of emphasis on recent biomass distribution, with alternative 2B2 having more of an emphasis on recent biomass distribution than 2B1. So I'm not going to get into the math too much. The details are described in the draft EIS and in the hearing document. And in summary, alternative 2B1 calculates the biomass regional change as a percent change in the north relative to their biomass during the first time period. And then that's applied as a percent change in allocation relative to the northern region starting allocation. Alternative 2B2 calculates the biomass regional change as a shift, an additive shift relative to the coast, which is based on the simple change of the regional biomass in the north, that 67 to 80%, and applies that as a 13% shift in allocation relative to the coast. So in a bit more detail on what this means, 2B1 again, so calculates both of the changes, biomass changes and allocation changes, as a percent change relative to the north. So because percent changes are relative to a starting value, this method involves having to start with the northern region as the basis for the change and calculating the southern allocation as the remainder to make things add to 100. So in both alternatives, the state allocations are then calculated from the regional change in allocation based on states maintaining their current share of the combined regional allocation. So this again results in a more moderate shift in allocation compared to alternative 2B2. So overall, the percent change relative to the existing state allocations in the northern states, that results in a 19% increase to the northern states relative to each northern state's starting allocation, and a 9% decrease in southern states relative to the southern state's starting allocation. So the magnitude of those relative changes is different because the northern and the southern states start with a different allocation by region. The south starts off with more allocations, so their change relative to their baseline is smaller in magnitude. When you're looking at the rightmost column there in the table, in terms of the change in share of coast-wide percentages, this option shifts 6% of the coast-wide allocation from the south to the north. And then the state outcomes in terms of change in share of the total coast-wide quota ranges from a high of 3% to Rhode Island and a reduction of 2.5% from the coast-wide allocation in North Carolina. So this is a similar table for alternative 2B2. And again, this option is calculated by applying that 13% shift in regional biomass toward the north as a 13% shift in regional allocation relative to the coast. So the southern region allocation is reduced by 13%, and the northern region is increased by 13% relative to the coast. So that's 13% as compared to the previous slide, which was a 6% shift. This is a more substantial change in regional allocations, and it essentially creates a more substantial basis in recent biomass distribution, which was not part of the original basis for the current allocations at all, but it puts more emphasis on that recent biomass distribution. So like the previous table, the change relative to each state's existing allocation is different in the north versus the south. So the northern states increase their allocation by 40% relative to their starting allocation, and the southern states reduce theirs by 19%. And in terms of changes in share of total coastwide quota, this shifts things to a maximum increase of 6% of the coastwide quota to Rhode Island and a decrease of about 5% in North Carolina. So again, I don't have time to get too much into the impacts of this. Obviously, this alternative is going to have socioeconomic impacts on states, on individual participants, and shoreside infrastructure and businesses. And I will kind of try to briefly summarize what's in the public hearing document, which is again a summarized version of what will be in the EIS. So the economic impacts are more substantial under alternative 2B2 compared to 2B1 because it again results in a larger shift in allocation. And it's not necessarily straightforward to predict the overall economic impacts on each state, although they will sort of generally be described in the documents as impacts by state and to some extent breaking it down further than that where possible. But the economic impacts are really going to depend on the characteristics of each state's fishery, and in addition, the impacts on individual participants and shoreside businesses are also going to vary based on factors like current and future restrictions on total fishing participation and how each state would respond in terms of their management measures and general approach to management to an increased or reduced commercial allocation. So moving on to alternative 2C. 2C is another possible modification to the current allocations that would set an annual coastwide quota trigger for modifying state allocations. There are two sub-options for different quota triggers in this alternative. Alternative 2C1 uses a 5-year recent average of commercial quotas, which is equivalent to 8.4 million pounds, and then alternative 2C2 uses a 10-year average, which is a 10.71 million pound trigger. The way that this would work is in years where the quota is at or below the trigger, the allocations would be status quo. In years where that trigger is exceeded, the additional quota beyond that trigger would be distributed differently. And note that it's only the additional quota that gets distributed differently. Up to the baseline still gets distributed status quo no matter what. So in this case, the additional quota beyond the trigger would be distributed by equal shares to each state, with the exception of Maine, New Hampshire, and Delaware, which between the three of them would split 1% of the coastwide additional quota. So this means that Maine, New Hampshire, and Delaware would receive 0.333% of the additional quota, and all other states would receive 12.375% of the additional quota. The total state allocation would vary by year depending on the total annual quota and the amount of additional quota to be distributed, as I'll show in the next couple slides. So for option 2C1 here, this figure shows us the 8.4 million pound trigger amount. So the x-axis of this figure is the annual commercial quota, showing approximately the range of quotas that have been put in place throughout the FMP history since 1993. So that ranges from about 6 to 18 million pounds. And under 2C1, this figure shows that allocations are stable up to that 8.4 million pound trigger, stable at status quo. And after that point, the state shares get closer together because this alternative distributes the additional quota equally, and the more additional quota there is to be distributed, the more similar each state's total allocation share becomes as the annual quota gets larger. The states that currently have more than 12% of the coastwide quota, which include North Carolina, Virginia, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, eventually start to lose quota share as the quota goes beyond the trigger point, and all other states see an increase in their state share of the quota beyond that trigger point. So this shows the same thing, but for option 2C2, using a 10.71 million pound trigger. And the difference is here, the threshold is just higher, the quota, the state shares remain status quo for longer up until that 10.71 trigger amount. So we can get an idea of what a realistic range of outcomes might look like by looking back at historical quotas since 1993 and comparing them to the trigger as shown in this figure. So the lower line is the alternative 2C1, the 8.4 million pound trigger, and the coastwide quota has been above that in 22 of the last 26 years. And alternative 2C2, the red dashed line, the coastwide quota has been above that in 17 of the last 26 years. So I quickly want to point out this table, which is in the hearing document, and as an extension of the figure I just showed, I wanted to show this to note that the way that we can kind of estimate the plausible allocation percentage range for each state is essentially by looking at what those allocations would be under the time series low and time series high quotas. The time series low is 5.66 million pounds from 2017, and the time series high is 17.9 million pounds from 2005. So again, for North Carolina, Virginia, Rhode Island, and New Jersey, the high allocation share is going to be under status quo allocations, and for all other states, the high would essentially be at the high end of expected coastwide quotas. All right, so that's it for alternative 2C. Moving on to 2D, or the Scup model. This would manage the commercial summer flounder fishery like Scup, with 2 coastwide winter periods managed under coastwide quotas and measures, and 1 summer period that would be managed under state-by-state quotas and measures. So the proposed dates for the quota periods are shown here. There was some discussion at the last few meetings about the month of October and where it should be relative to these quota periods. So recently, the final rule for the modification to the Scup quota period dates just published, and that moves October from the summer period into winter 2 for Scup. For summer flounder, as proposed in this document, the quota period dates would be like they were for Scup before that change, with the month of October in the summer quota period. However, there is a note in the public hearing document that the Council and Board are seeking comments on the quota period dates, and in the draft EIS there is an appendix that includes more information about looking specifically at the month of October and why it's proposed to be included in the summer. So during the winter periods, there would be coastwide possession limits, closure triggers, and quota rollover provisions like there are for Scup currently. These would be reviewed and recommended by the monitoring committee each year and adopted by the Council and Board during specifications. There are not any specific measures proposed yet through this action. These would need to be developed by the monitoring committee if needed, if this is the preferred alternative, based on more in-depth analysis of expected participation in these fisheries, and then depending on the quota for the relevant fishing year. So there are 2 sub-alternatives under this alternative 2D. 2D1 includes an exemption for the state of Maryland for this alternative due to their management of their fishery under an IFQ system, which is sort of incompatible with coastwide management systems. So Maryland under 2D1 would retain their current share of a little over 2% of the coastwide quota, and that would be sort of taken off the top of the annual coastwide quota every year, and Maryland would not be participating in those open coastwide quota periods. Alternative 2D2 is no exemption for Maryland under this system. So the allocations between quota periods and by state for the summer shares are based on 1997 through 2016 landings history. And for the summer shares, it only includes landings during those summer months, so May through October. For alternative 2D1, the calculation of these allocations excludes Maryland. it really doesn't make too much of a difference between the two alternatives. It's a pretty minor difference. This is showing 2D2, and for alternative 2D2, Maryland is included. There is a table in the draft EIS that sort of compares the differences in allocations between these sub-options, and they're pretty minor. So in terms of impacts of alternative 2D, the introduction of coast-wide management periods results in a lot of uncertainty about what the impacts of this would be. We don't have a good sense of what the increase in participation might look like yet, what the specific measures would need to be during those coast-wide periods. It's possible that under this alternative, as described in the document, that there could be some degree of latent effort, re-entry to the fishery if certain vessels are not participating right now due to restrictions in their current state. They could re-enter the fishery if it was a little bit more open to participation from various states. It's not clear, exactly in the grand scheme of things during the coast-wide quota period where the landing's going to tend to be landed relative to the current conditions. So it's very unpredictable in terms of what would happen if we opened this fishery to coast-wide management in the winter periods. Another thing noted in the document is that it's going to probably be difficult to develop possession limits that are uniform in state and federal waters along the coast that are acceptable to varying states and participants, larger vessels, smaller vessels, and along the coast in the management unit. So another thing that's noted in the document is that the Council Board, the last time this was discussed, brought up some concerns about the potential for derby fishing under open coast-wide quota periods. And there was some suggestion that maybe this alternative should be taken out, but the Council and Board decision was to keep it in for public hearings and specifically note the request for public comments on the potential for derby fishing during open coast-wide quota periods. So that is noted in the public hearing document as well. All right, and finally, briefly going into the third alternative set, which is the landings flexibility framework provisions. There are two options in the document. One is no action, status quo. Landings flexibility would need to be done through an amendment on the council side if landings flexibility policies were to be implemented. So the landings flexibility, could include varying configurations of vessels being able to land in any state. It could include things like multiple possession limits being allowed to be on board a vessel for offloading in multiple states. You could possess, for example, 2 different states' possession limits, land in one state, and then go to the next state and offload the rest. So landings flexibility, there is an option 3B to add that as a frameworkable item in the Council's FMP. The Commission can likely already do this through an addendum, so this isn't necessary to modify the Commission's FMP. This is to modify the Council's FMP so that landings flexibility policies could be implemented through a future framework action. So there's a variety of ways that landings flexibility could work. Those details would need to be worked out at the time of a future framework action, and those future framework actions would include separate analyses and separate public comment processes for those actions. As described in the hearing document, the impacts of this are going to be primarily administrative. This alternative does not propose any immediate changes to the way that landings for summer flounder work, so there's no immediate proposal for landings flexibility in this amendment, so there's no direct impacts expected as the result of landings flexibility policies. It's just that we could, through alternative 3B, do this through a framework instead of an amendment. The impacts of that are going to vary based on the details of a future action, and landings flexibility does have the potential to impact the fishery substantially depending on how it's configured. So there are some concerns about how quota would be accounted for, how enforcement issues would work, some of the administrative burdens associated with landings flexibility, some of which is explained in the hearing document. And given some of these issues, it may mean that the impacts would be significant under NEPA. So for the Council's federal requirements, we may be required to do an EIS depending on what's proposed for landings flexibility. In this case, although a framework theoretically saves time in terms of Magnuson requirements, having to do an EIS would essentially eliminate those time savings. So it's depends on what specifically is proposed, but just so everyone understands that it's not necessarily going to be a quick framework action. If this happens in the future, like some of our quick 2 council meeting frameworks, it may require a little bit more in-depth analysis. Okay, and that's it for the range of alternatives. So the next steps following approval of a public hearing document is to work with states to schedule public hearings, potentially for July and August if the document is approved today. The draft EIS is scheduled for approval at the June council meeting, and then we do have to, on the federal side, notice the public hearings 23 days in advance, and then we would have final action scheduled for December of this year. And so, in addition to all these commercial issues, Chris Moore couldn't be here today. He wanted to be here but had a conflicting workshop this week. So Chris did want me to kind of mention some issues ongoing for summer flounder in addition to the commercial actions. So they're specifically the council's funded projects for summer flounder that could feed into future management actions and potentially have applicability for other council managed species as well. So the first one is a quick update on that commercial recreational economic allocation model for summer flounder. The council and board saw a presentation on this back in December 2016, and that model, we do plan to update that with revised MRIP data when that becomes available later this summer. And that will feed into the process of reviewing the commercial recreational fishery allocations when the time comes to take that up. And then the second project is a recently funded management strategy evaluation project to evaluate F-based management and other recreational management strategies in the recreational fishery. This proposal was posted as part of the meeting materials for the council's first April meeting earlier this month. For anyone that wants to take a look at that, it's in the executive director's report section of that meeting materials from a couple weeks ago. So this project could feed into a modified recreational management strategy for summer flounder in the future, and we do expect preliminary results from that project by the end of this year and final results sometime next year. So Chris just wanted me to note that we have several things going on for summer flounder in addition to the commercial actions that we've talked about today. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Kylie. Well-developed, well-presented, reflecting a lot of hard work on the part of staff and drawing upon a lot of hard work on the part of the Demersal Committee that Rob O'Reilly chaired, and involving some contributions from board members as well. So a lot here, a lot of good information that's been well-developed over several months, and an impressive kind of pulling together of everything here, in my opinion. I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm going to just start with one. Kylie, does the current FMP allow for quota transfers between states, and would that continue forward under any of these options that you presented with regard to the commercial allocation issue?
Yes, the FMP does allow for quota transfers between states, and there are no proposed changes to that, so that would still be allowed under the current alternatives.
Thank you for that. Other questions for Kylie and Jim Gilmore?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and that was a great summary, Kylie. That was, after reading this thing, it was, you answered about most of my questions. I just had one on impacts. You had it under 2D. You mentioned, I guess, the difficulty in analyzing the impacts because the latent permits, I guess, are different of how they would be handled in each state. So is that the way it would work, is each state would have to come up with some way of how they're going to deal with latent permits, so there wouldn't be a general provision across the fishery? Each state would have to come up with a separate approach to how they're going to deal with the latent permits?
I think the point there is that it's difficult to analyze what the participation in the coastwide winter fisheries would be, because you may have vessels both at the state permitted level and federal permits that may choose to participate if what's currently constraining them from participating is lack of opportunity in a current state due to management and allocation. If things were opened up more broadly in a coastwide winter period, there may be a range of participation that we're not able to exactly predict. So it's not necessarily to say that states would have to address latent effort, but it's a problem for analyzing the impacts.
Jim?
Just to follow up, just so you know, we're in New York, we're starting an effort to look at that. We essentially are hired a consultant to come up with how we're going to deal with that latent permit, because like we and a lot of other states, we have too many people in the fishery, so we're going to try to get at that. And just a follow-up question, so to Bob's point, There is quota transfers allowed in the FMP right now, but they are completely voluntary. There's no way to mandate them, and just reference back to recreational fluke when we had that voluntary transfer issue and how well it worked because no one ever wanted to do it. So it's a voluntary thing, not a mandatory thing, correct?
Correct.
Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Kylie. And I'm wondering if it is sufficient for the public, when we look at page 14 of the information that we have, to indicate that the NEFSC spring and fall survey catches about them, that they were used because they represent the only data sets with enough coverage in space and time to describe changes in geographic distribution of the stock over time. Goes on to say that if you want more information, go to the DEIS, and there'll even be information on the strata and everything else. For the public hearing document, does there need to be a little more explanation? Because although you're indicating those are the surveys with the time series, when this first started out in the Demersal Committee, it was well talked about the fact that there are other surveys, there are other areas of coverage that won't be included. And I think that if there could be something a little bit more, it might help to indicate that this is not a complete depiction of summer flounder distribution. It's a good depiction because the survey has the time series, but when you talk about the strata and the depth involved, I think the public may not realize what they're looking at in terms of those two options, 2B1 and 2B2, where they're almost treated like absolute indices. And, you know, I think there could be something else here, but I would ask, you know, not just Kylie, but also the chair, if there should be something to describe that there are other surveys, they just weren't available. You seem to be saying that, but you don't seem to be saying anything about the distribution of summer flounder isn't completely captured by the NEFSC trawl survey. Something I've been thinking about. Thank you.
Kylie, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, this alternative 2B is probably the most difficult one to describe in the document, and we're certainly open to suggestions about how to describe what this option is about in the level of detail that's appropriate for the hearing document. I think what you're suggesting is probably a slight wording adjustment to that description to just say, although there are other state indices, the federal indices are the only ones that really provide the spatial and temporal coverage that we need.
And Rob, maybe we'll circle back to that. I mean, you have a follow, and that's fine. I'll go to you next here. But I'm thinking right now this is questions. When we circle back to any recommended changes, that might be one you want to bring up again. It seems like a fair request. Did you have something else right now? Thank you. Lori Nolan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amazing presentation, Kirby. You brought us all up to speed. Thank you. I wonder if on the Scup model alternatives, you mentioned public comment fearing the creation of derby fishing if we were to shift over to that type of management. If language could be added that the follow-up intent to a Scup model would be, you know, trip limits, weekly trip limits, as the states currently implement in order to prevent the derby fishing, that we wouldn't just open the gates and say, go get it, guys. That, you know, the intent of the council and the commission would be to create some sort of trip limit or mechanism that would reduce the odds of this going into a derby fishery.
Yeah, I think there's some language in there that reflects, you know, possession limits are needed and that kind of thing. I mean, I think, yeah, we can clarify, yeah, that derby fishing is not wide open, but, you know, yeah.
And Lori, again, if you want to, when we get to the point of trying to make tweaks to the document, which is about to happen in a few minutes, if you want to suggest that kind of thing along the lines of what Rob suggested to that other part, that would be a good good suggestions. So again, we'll be pulling these together in the form of because we're going to want consensus on the part of both the board and the council on moving forward with this document, subject to any of the changes that are currently being recommended. So keep those thoughts, because I want to make sure we capture them all when we get to the point of decision and motions. I had Chris Batsevich next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kylie, on the federal permit requalification issue, in the public information document, is it possible to show the impact of the sub-options at the state level? In other words, to show the number of permits that could potentially be lost, I guess, from looking at the home port of who owns them now, to get a sense of how things may be distributed if under the different options. I'm kind of thinking along the lines of what was shown in the squid capacity amendment last year. Thanks.
Yeah, that's something we've talked about doing, for at least for the draft EIS. I think for the public hearing document, we're trying to keep it a little simpler, but if the council board think that information should be added to the hearing document as well, we can certainly look into doing that. I'm not positive about how easy or difficult that is to do with summer flounder, but I think it's definitely something we've talked about doing for the EIS.
Roger Mann.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, my compliments, Kylie, for putting this together. This is a very dense, complex matter, and I think the document that you wrote was very well done. In your presentation, you asked for some guidance on the use of precision estimates. So let me run through some numbers here. So we have a stock assessment that comes out at about 8 million pounds. It has say a 60% log normally distributed CV on it, which means that 8 million pounds is maybe plus or minus a million pounds. Then we take the point estimate in the middle, and we take it out to 5 decimal places of 1%, which means that we are attempting to manage this fishery, and that's what this document says, in units of 12 ounces. Now, you state in the legend of Table 3 that quota percentages are taken out to 5 decimal places in FMPs and federal regulations. So my question is are you glued to that unit of 12 ounces, or can we actually put this in something that's more reasonable? Because what this document says is we can manage it in units of 12 ounces. I don't think we can. And what I'm trying to do here is to suggest that we have a conversation where the numbers that we put out here are rational in terms of the way in which we manage things. If we can only get an assessment to plus or minus of a CV of 60%, we're actually cutting up fish here. And that doesn't work. So I know that this is something that's imposed on you, and maybe we can't change this. But what I'd like to suggest, in fact, is that we really ought to rationally think about the numbers that we put in these things, because they are a public document and they're a record of the conversations that we have around this table. And by approving this document, it says that all of us agree that we can manage this in units of 12 ounces. Thank you.
Kylie, do you have a thought on that very interesting comment?
Yeah, I don't think we're glued to that level of precision. I guess the question is then just how do you handle states like New Hampshire where they have a very low allocation? I think that's why they are the way they are. When we set annual quotas, I think we take them to 2 decimal places in the regs, and then we have sort of an even starting point, but we do have to then divide that by state down to the pound. So there has to be some rounding somewhere. But yeah, we are open to different ways of doing that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And as I see it, the New Hampshire quota is about 30 fish, middle-sized fish, give or take a fish. Lots of people around this table have way more experience in this conversation than I do. I would just like to see that when we put this document out for the public hearing, it doesn't become a record of embarrassment of the fact that we didn't note this.
Duly noted. Thank you, Roger. Additional questions for Kylie at this point, or Kirby? Seeing none, let me now look to the audience before we go back, before we take up our deliberations on this matter. I'd like to see if there's anyone in the audience who would like to comment. First, let me just see if there's any hands. Seeing none, I will bring this back to the board and council, and let's open with basically the key questions that the board and council are being asked to come to terms with today. Are the board and council comfortable with the draft document as presented? Do the board and council feel that the document contains a clear explanation of the options and their impacts with an appropriate level of detail? If so, Mike and I would entertain dual motions from the council and board to approve the draft document for public comment. If there are any proposed changes, now would be the time to offer those proposals. So I think we have sort of two camps here. One would be, and I've already collected some thoughts offered by Rob and Lori and Chris and Roger about perhaps making some, what I would call tweaks to the document to better clarify its intent. And those, I think, are ones that can indeed be captured, and I'll ask those folks to sort of reiterate those suggestions now if they'd like to make them. And then if there's anyone that is proposing or would like to propose anything more substantive, that will absolutely require, a motion and discussion on the motion. So that's where we are right now, and I'm looking to any member of the board or council for input in the way that I just framed the questions. Tom Foti.
One concern I've always had about the growth of the biomass, and we start talking about migration up north. What I look at is that the fact that the small fish have always been and they always were where they are now. There really hasn't been a migration of those fish north. What has been seen, as we know the history of summer flounder, as the fish gets larger, it has a tendency to migrate north. So to say that the whole stock is migrating north, I would like to see the biomass broken down by numbers of fish, so we have an idea of whether the same amount of fish is in the south than it was in the north years ago, and just the fact that you have bigger fish in the north, that the quota becomes larger and the biomass becomes larger. Nowhere do I see any of those figures that looked at the total number of fish broken down by the surveys. I would like to see that information in the document, just so I have an understanding, because we tend to see, we all sit around here and say, well, they're migrating north. And I know there's stocks that are doing, I can tell you, surf clams in New Jersey and things like that. But in summer flounder, I think it has to do more with the migrating of the big fish north, that the increase in the poundage has come from those big 12-year-old fish, 11-year-old fish, 9-year-old fish that were not, when we started this plan, there was only 1s, 2s, and 3s, because I was sitting around a table, and that's all we had is a biomass. So there wasn't a lot of fish up north. As we grew the size of the fish, they migrated north. So I'd like to see the figures broken down that way, just for my own hate and clarification. And I really agree with Mr. Mann said over there. We look sometimes ridiculous when we start doing things like that, managing by ounces, when we're looking at, CVs of 60% and things like that, especially when we look at PSEs of such large percentages. So I know we want to be exact, and we know we want to try to do it by pounds, but sometimes it just doesn't make any sense.
So Kylie, can Tom's suggestion be accommodated as you understand it?
So I will note that the analysis that's represented in the document does include exploitable biomass based on a cutoff of 14 inches to focus on biomass that is able to be retained by the commercial fishery. So it doesn't include the smallest fish. It includes fish above 14 inches. So I'm not sure about the numbers of fish suggestion. I would have to check with the Science Center about that. I'm not sure if that's possible or not, and if we do, whether that should be included in this document or in the draft EIS. I think we would have to check in with the Science Center about that.
I had Tony Delernia next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to include a couple of additional options to the public hearing document. And again, let me emphasize, reminding everyone that this is just a public hearing document. By including these two options doesn't mean that this is going to be the way to go, but I would like them to be included in the public hearing document so that when public hearings are held up and down the coast, members from all of the different states hear what those options would be. So I would like to, I guess I need a motion. I would move to include 2 additional options to the summer flounder draft amendment. One will be negotiated permanent interstate quota transfers, and 2, coast-wide measures. And if I receive a second, and if you'd like me to speak further to my motion, I'd be happy to. But that's my motion. Negotiated permanent interstate quota transfers is one option, and the second option would be coast-wide measures.
Is there a second to Tony's motion on the part of any member of the council who's not from New York?
They can.
Oh, the council, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Lori, you're perfectly eligible to be the seconder of that motion. So moved and seconded by Tony Delarnia and Lori Nolan on behalf of the council. We'll need a like motion on behalf of the board. Emerson, would you like to make that motion?
Yes, do you need me to read it into the record?
Not at this moment. Let me first, because I assume it's the same motion.
Correct.
So that's just, we'll catch up, but I think for now we know what you're moving. Is there a second to, on the part of any board member who's not from New York, to Emerson's motion on behalf of the board? We have Matt Gates. So moved and seconded by both the council and the board, and I trust the language is up on the screen, and I'll make sure Tony concurs that that's the motion you wish to make. And he's nodding yes. So we now have a motion moved and seconded. And Tony, you'd like to speak to your motion. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to note that, again, these are options that I feel should be available to the public for public comment. At one of the joint committee meetings, I was asked by a council member after some of the other proposed solutions were presented, if any of those proposed solutions would be acceptable to the state of New York. And at that time, my response was I didn't know, because I couldn't just speak for myself, but rather the proposed measures had to be reviewed by those others in New York, fishermen, legislators, etc. Since then, I can tell you that the proposed options that have been included in the amendment up to this point don't satisfy some of the issues that are concerned, the state of New York is concerned with. And so it would be, New York could not support any of the options included in the current draft amendment. I'd also like to point out that the draft amendment that we're discussing taking out the public hearing is still using the 1980s data. And by the time we get done, that data will be 40 years old. And we have guidance from the agency that basically says that, data that's 40 years old should be considered suspect. And I think there was a current agreement at the CCC meetings that data and that quota should be re-examined about every 10 years. Well, this quota system using the 80s data distribution is 30 years overdue based on the current agreement at the CCC meeting. Finally, we need to bring this out to public hearing, and let's see what some of the affected states, what the fishermen from the affected states would say, because I believe that the fishermen believe that they would like to see us come to a solution and negotiate a solution here at the table, be it negotiated permanent interstate quota transfers or whatever, rather than have elected officials or the judges and the courts decide this issue for us. Because we're hearing lots of noise from elected officials that if we don't come to a solution soon, they will try to fix it for us from the floor of the House or the Senate. And we also hear government officials saying if we can't come to a solution, they're very happy to go to federal court to challenge it. Well, I got a feeling if we go to federal court and it's challenged, and if the judge does negate the current FMP, the only option then would be to institute coast-wide measures for a number of years to reestablish a new baseline. Folks are very concerned and worried about that, and I can understand why. Perhaps with some of the provisions that Laurie's asking for, that coastwide management system would not be as draconian, but it could be. So I would like to see a really open discussion amongst the states, and let's face it, some of the southern states could lose a few percentage points, but perhaps those southern states might be willing to consider transferring a few percentage points versus what some of the options may be with some of the other alternatives if we're given a solution from the U.S. Congress or given a solution by the federal courts. So I'd like to bring them out to public hearing. Once it goes to public hearing, we hear what people say, well, then we have to make a decision. We don't have to make a permanent decision now, but the only decision we have to do right now is decide whether or not we want these two options in the public hearing document. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Could you provide me, anyway, with some clarification? I think I'll go to the easiest one first. Number 2, would that be better worded coastwide quota, or do you intend it to be coastwide measures? I'm trying to think of what measures means. I think I know what a coastwide quota means, but can you clarify your intent there?
Well, yeah, coastwide quota, and from the, I guess from the coastwide quota would come the coastwide measures. We don't want a gold rush for a wide open fishery. I mean, that's something no one wants. But it may be I'm afraid that that's what the court might give us if it's challenging federal court and if the state of New York prevails. Coastwide quota measures, coastwide management. Consistent coastwide management, the same management amongst all the states, to the quota.
Okay, thank you. And then to the first point, can you provide some more clarification on what that option would entail to negotiate permanent interstate quota transfers? Could you just provide a little bit more edification on your intent there with that proposed option?
I'd be happy to. Yes, sir. Thank you. If you look at the current distribution of quota amongst the states, and again, I would probably use New York being sandwiched between Rhode Island and New Jersey. I forget the percentage points, but it's basically New York has about 50% of the quota from compared to New Jersey or compared to Rhode Island. It's clear that, and we know that that fishery basically took place offshore of South Shore of Long Island and the Hudson Canyon, and yet the quota, the current percentage distribution, New York is 50% of its neighbors. We also have evidence that the stock has shifted, contrary to what perhaps my colleague from the state of New Jersey may differ with me on that. We have lots of evidence from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center that there has been a stock shift. We keep hearing, we held a workshop at one point in having to deal with climate change and fisheries management in the future. So it may be possible that some of the have states may want to sacrifice a couple of percentage points of total quota and transfer them to New York. I mean, if New York were not to be equal to its neighbors, but if New York was able to somehow get to around 14% or so, I believe that New York would at that point say, okay, well, we're close enough to the solution. So that would mean that perhaps some of the southern states like North Carolina or Virginia may have to give up a couple of percentage points. Perhaps New Jersey might have to give up some. Maybe Rhode Island might give up a percentage point or so. But if that can be a negotiated settlement, I believe that that's better, perhaps, than the alternatives, which could be, again, negating the current FMP and going to just coastwide management for everybody at the same rules. I suspect if we ended up with coastwide management, many of the boats from the southern states would relocate to New Jersey and to Long Island to get in on the fish and the coastwide gold rush if that occurred. Well, if that happens, a lot of fish are going to come across the dock in New York, and not as many fish are going to come across the dock in Virginia and North Carolina. And so those states could see a much more significant reduction in their total statewide quota, current percentage ownership now, than what they would see if there was a negotiated transfer. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Mike Pettany.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You actually asked my question, which was for clarification on point number 2, as to whether that meant to include coast-wide quotas rather than coast-wide management measures. Thank you for answering the question, but I do think the wording of the motion would be more clear if it specifically said to include coast-wide quota and management.
So with that, and with Tony DeLernia nodding yes, but this really belongs to the board now. So let me ask, is there any objection to modifying the motion to reword number 2 to read, to include coast-wide quota and management? Is there any objection to that rewording of the motion? Seeing no objection, the motion has been amended as such, and we're now continuing with our discussion. And next I have Tom Foti.
When I start hearing lawsuits, and I've been threatened for the last, I guess the commission has threatened for the last 7 years, if New York doesn't get its way, it's going to sue. You know, that was one of the reasons we got stuck in a region with New York. I'm tired of it. Go ahead and sue. I mean, if that's what you want to do. But we're here supposed to be working as collegiate, get that together. And, you know, New Jersey did that many years ago when we gave away 20% of our black sea bass commercial quota to other states to make this plan work on black sea bass. And look at how we've been rewarded over the years for doing things like that. It's not very conducive to making us think. I mean, the latest example is when I look at the map of where basically New York is proposing all its windmills, and basically it's off the shores of New Jersey. It's sometimes 40 miles away from New York, but it's about 15 miles away from my coastline. It doesn't seem to be this collegiality that we need to establish between groups working together. And it basically, it just turns me off when I get here. I mean, because I can say New Jersey will do the same thing. You start transferring our quota away from the state that we have. And as far as historical references, we're using striped bass references that go back 80 years, younger the year indexes and things like that. That data has been proven to be as valid as we can get over the years with time span and things like that. So tell me 40-year-old data is not good, because we have it on sturgeon, we have it on many species that we sit here and manage at the commission because we put in the research to do it. And, you know, I've been sitting around the table for almost 40 years, not at this table alone, but at the council table, and it just really burns me.
Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with everything that Tony said and the issues that he raised. You know, the baseline period that we're working off of is over 30 years, getting close to be 40 years ago. We have evidence that there's been a northward shift in summer flounder biomass, as well as a northward shift in fishing effort. This amendment was originally being developed to address the severe inequities inherent in the current state-by-state allocation from 30 to 40 years ago. The alternatives in this document do not address these inequities right now. Let's include these new items in the document and hear what the public has to say. Let's get some input, and let's take care of this here around this table rather than in the courts. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris Patsevich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kylie, how much time will this add to the timeline for going out to public comment if we include these two options? And if any further delays in the development of this amendment occur, is that going to impact anything else coming down the pike with summer flounder, such as, you know, the MRIP recalibration and looking at recreational issues?
Kylie? Yeah, glad you asked that question. I was thinking about raising timeline issues as well. So essentially, if we make substantive changes to the document today and add alternatives, it's going to delay the timeline probably substantially. So we have tentative final action scheduled for December 2018. That would not happen if we added additional options. What happens essentially around June is that work on fluke scup sea bass stuff is going to, it ramps up every year around that time. This year is going to be even worse with the MRIP numbers coming down the pipe. 2019 specifications need to be developed for summer flounder, and we also have the development of a benchmark stock assessment that involves multiple working group meetings over the second half of this year. So there's a lot of other things going on for summer flounder, and the addition of extra alternatives is going to involve modification of all three of those documents we talked about and additional work from partners at the Science Center and Garfo to help analyze those. So the shorter answer is we're not sure how long it would delay the amendment, but it would delay final action definitely until sometime in 2019.
Thank you. Adam Nowalski.
Thank you. No, that was the issue I wanted to touch on. Thank you.
Thank you. Rob O'Reilly.
I too had those concerns, and I think in the documents that we received, the briefing materials, it even went so far to say that it could bring this process to a halt. So, and then on the coastwide, just a few moments ago, a little while ago, Kylie, when she presented the coastwide approach for the Scup model, she indicated how difficult it is to even understand what the impacts might be. So I think we ought to keep that in mind as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I tend to disagree completely with the impacts on the timeline. The two options we're putting up, first off, the negotiated share with option one, essentially there's no way to analyze that. There's nothing to analyze because you're going to have dozens of iterations. The whole idea, and maybe to describe it a little bit better, is if you looked at option 2B2 in the document right now, that gives percentages, but it actually, the problem I saw with it is that you're taking states that actually have a pretty large share, and you're actually giving them more that they probably don't need. So there's no way to adjust that in the document right now. So all we're saying is that you could take that, say, as a basis, and then maybe use those percentages to distribute them differently. But again, there's nothing in the document that allows that to happen. So for option one, there's nothing to analyze right now that would slow this document down if we put this option in. And coastwide measures is number two. Again, it's in the document under the Scup model that's something that would have to be considered because you'd have a coastwide fishery, coastwide management during part of the year. Again, that's something it already, you said in your presentation before, Kylie, it's something that's very difficult to manage because we don't know how latent effort's going to work up and down the coast. So there's actually nothing to analyze at this point. So if you include both of these right now, we can still put this document out on the street and still meet the deadline. And remember, the deadline is this would not go into effect until 2020. That's assuming if it goes out today. That's 6 years since we started this amendment. So, right now we want those two measures in, as Emerson and Tony had both said, because we want to have the public review a full range of options that will solve the issue that we're trying to deal with. And without these options, I don't think we're going to have that happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Kylie, did you have a thought on that?
Yeah, so I think there would be quite a bit of work involved with adding those alternatives because the first thing we'd have to do is sort of rewrite and restructure the description of the alternatives. And to your point about analysis, we do have to analyze those as part of our NEPA requirements. As you mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty about what that would mean. We would have no real way of knowing, what those permanent quota transfers would be, but what we have to do for our federal requirements is essentially come up with a realistic range of what might happen and use that to describe possible impacts. We can't, in our federal process, get away with not describing the impacts of that at all. And the other thing that I will mention is for the EIS, we do have to analyze we have to do a cumulative effects analysis, and we have to analyze every combination of alternatives with with different permit requalification alternatives, and so we essentially have to look at the overall picture of what's happening and analyze every alternative in combination with others and in combination with other factors that are external to the amendment. So it does involve some additional analysis.
Mike Bettany.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, my point was already addressed, but I just wanted to stress that while we're certainly sensitive to the notion that this would require additional analysis, as Kylie said, and that will extend the timeline, I did want to stress the point that Jim Gilmore made that December 2018 is a great target for completing this action, but we're not going to see changes to the implemented quotas until 2020 regardless. And so a 3 or 4 month delay in completion of this document, in order to make sure that we fully considered and analyzed all reasonable alternatives, still can allow us to have those new quotas, if there are any, in place January of 2020. Thank you.
Thank you. John Clark?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think my question's been mostly answered, but it's just more have to do with the mechanics of this. As has been pointed out, it's taken 4 years to get to this point where you have 4 allocation options. What would this option actually look like? Is it just to be determined what the actual allocation would be? I guess this is a question to the maker of the motion, because just from some of the back and forth there, it seems like it's either no extra effort or it's a lot of extra effort to come up with all these new and different options here. So it's just kind of vague at this point as to how this would actually be included in the amendment, and I'd just like a little more explanation of that. Thank you.
Tony, do you want to take a crack at that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you. I mean, for negotiated permanent state quota transfers, let me just remind everyone, Amendment 4 to this plan, which was done in 1994, created or transferred quota, was a negotiated transfer of quota from all the affected states to the state of Connecticut. If you read the language and the justification in Amendment 4 to the plan and substitute the word or the state New York for wherever you see the state Connecticut, you have a justification for this transfer. I think the only other person sitting here, I think I see Dave Borden there. I think Dave remembers when we did this. But it was states recognizing that Connecticut didn't get what was considered its fair share, and there was some of the states gave up quota. New York State even gave up quota to the state of Connecticut to try to make the state of Connecticut whole. And so what this negotiated permanent interstate quota transfer would be similar to what we did in Amendment 4, in which some of the states would give up no more than 2.5% to transfer to increase New York State's quota. Some of the other states would give up 1.5%. I mean, if I had to first crack at it, I would ask North Carolina for 2.5%, Virginia for maybe 2%, Rhode Island for 1%, 1.5%, New Jersey for 1.5%. I think I could get to around 14% there, which again gives New York less than its neighbors, but it recognizes that there was an injustice, in a sense, done to the state of New York when this was first developed, and tries to smooth that out. So, John, I don't know if that answers your question there. That's what I would, hopefully we could do that.
Yeah, just to follow up, I was just curious as to, so in other words, let's say option 2B or 2C or whatever is chosen, then as part of that you would say states can permanently transfer part of whatever quota they get under this allocation to New York based on negotiations at what, I mean, is it going to be specified that would take place before the amendment is approved or after it's approved?
Well, I would think that if we have this go out, and if there is, in a sense, if we take it out to public hearing, and there is a discussion at the public hearings that perhaps what that could be, well, then we could come back and look at what some of the percentage transfers would be, and then I think the analysis would have to be done if some states gave up 2%, 2.5%. Then you would do the analysis, and then perhaps we would have to go out for public hearing again. I'm not sure what the process would be there. But right now, we don't even have this ability to have a negotiated transfer. It's not even an option in the public hearing document. And all I'm saying is, included in the public hearing document, if folks say, yeah, possibly this is something we want to do, well, then let's come back and then let's sit around this table again and let's see who can give the state of New York a couple of percentage points. Thank you.
Kirby?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as staff here, we're trying to better understand what these options may look like in the document. And in your response to what John had asked, I was starting to hear that this would actually modify some of the other options that are in the document in terms of whatever is chosen down the road in terms of new state quotas, or is this supposed to be a standalone option in the document that modifies the current status quo allocations by moving 1 or 2% Is it a range, or would it be one specific percentage amount that would go from certain states to New York?
First of all, to answer your first question, it would be a standalone. How much that transfer would be, it should be negotiated amongst the states. We should be able to discuss that. To put that in the public hearing document now, a real hard number now, that would require analysis. But just leaving it as an option and the percentage points to be determined later, I don't think would require as much analysis.
Bob Beal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question for the makers of the motion. Option number 1, negotiate permanent interstate quota transfers. It's really, seems to me it's really negotiated new state shares. I think transfer, it's a one-time movement of fish from one, or quota from one state to another, but really I think it's negotiated quotas. So maybe that's not a question, that's sort of the way I read it. The question is, what does permanent mean? Nothing we ever do is really permanent. I assume it means the new state shares would be maintained until the next management action came along and modified them. In other words, this action can't preclude future boards from modifying, making future modifications to state shares or the commercial management in some way. So I guess the question is, what's meant by permanent in that motion?
Tony?
Well, it would be, Bob is right, it would be new state shares or new percentages state shares. New York is looking to get about 6.5% total complete from this. So which states would give us that? We would negotiate that, but it would be new state shares. And to another point that Bob just raised, that you might be surprised to hear, for me, I would like to see this re-examined every 10 years. I don't think these quotas should stay in place forever. I mean, if we're going to see movement and shifts, I can't sit here and on one hand negotiate or ask to argue, well, we should make a transfer based on the stock shift, and then say, okay, I got mine, I'm going to go home, I'm never going to discuss this again. That would be hypocritical. So I would like to perhaps see it in the future re-examined about every 10 years or so. I think that's where we should be going with all these state quotas. So would it be to negotiate new state quota shares? Perhaps that's how it should be amended, to negotiate new state quota shares.
So let's first see if there's any objection to revising the motion to read under number 1, new option number 1, to negotiate new state quota shares. I think the rest would come out, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that's the, and then I guess in parentheses, permanent interstate. It's up to the board, but it seems to me that just saying to negotiate new state quota shares is just what Tony had suggested. And is there any objection to revising the motion to read that way? Is there an objection? Eric Reed.
Yeah, I object. I object, period. It seems to me that this whole exercise of going through this amendment is to negotiate new state quota shares. That's what the amendment is doing. We don't need to have a line item that tells us that we're going to negotiate shares. I also don't like some of the rationale is, well, if you give us a couple of points now, then we won't sue. I don't care for that. But I mean, we're trying to figure this out to provide more equitable solutions to certain states. But I want to look at how we got here. Originally, we looked at landings, and that's how we got where we were. Of course, some states, certain states, by their own congressional admission and in testimony in front of the Senate, they said, well, we can't count. Well, that's how we got where we were. We didn't do a good job of counting, so here we are. My question is to certain states is, what have you done since that time to assure us that you're going to be able to count or enforce in the future? And it seems to me that the answer to that is really nothing has changed. Budgets aren't any better than they used to be, so I'm not really sure what this is all about. As far as the analysis goes, I mean, when you start talking about looking at a coast-wide quota, Of course, the Scup model in portion is a coast-wide quota. So I'm wondering if just the Scup model alternative will elicit conversation about a coast-wide quota for the full year instead of a portion of the year, in which case that makes this unnecessary as long as certain states are willing to have their constituents talk about a coast-wide quota in full as opposed to a coast-wide quota in portions of the year. And my other question is, how many states are underutilizing their existing quota on a regular basis, then they would be in a position to, under threat of lawsuit, give up a couple of points now as opposed to maybe getting sued? I think the answer is everybody's using their quota. So I'm totally against this motion. I think the document, the way it is perfectly sufficient to elicit public comment. Thank you.
And Eric, if it's okay, I just want to make sure, because we're getting sort of bogged down in details, but as far as the wording of the motion goes, not that this discussion is not getting bogged down in detail, it's a very substantive discussion on a very important issue, but as far as amending the motion to just simply reword number 1, are you willing to at least leave it up on the board as such for now?
I mean, personally, the word permanent I think is useless. We've already had that conversation. To add that extra language, I think is a waste of time. But if the maker of the motion and the commission and the council want it, I mean, that's fine with me. It just seems useless.
Understood. So let's leave the wording as such, as amended, per consent of the board and council. I want to bring this to a vote very soon. I know Mike Louisi wanted to make one comment. I'd like to afford him that opportunity. And then if there's any other burning comments, particularly from members who have not yet commented, and I see John Maniscalco's hand go up, I will provide for some additional opportunity, but we do need to vote on this soon. Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just wanted to make the point that the public's waited a long time for this document to get something in their hands that they can comment on. And we do have the ability to make modifications after public comment. So even if these options are not in the document, they can still be, the public can still offer comment to the idea that the council and the commission could then fold back into the plan at a future date. What that would do is it would keep us on our timeline that Kylie mentioned, progressing towards the end. But then I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware of the fact that we could modify the document after the public comment this summer, if just so everyone was clear. Thanks.
Thank you. John Maniscalco.
Just wanted to address a few points made around the table. So the options currently in place are still heavily weighted by the old allocation systems. Biomass has shifted. We've kind of covered that. Landings reporting systems were different back then. And to address Eric's comment, federal dealer reporting was implemented in 1993 as part of Amendment 2. These allocations were based upon data from 1980 to 1989, prior to any coast-wide systematic system for collecting landings data. So the system has changed, and budgets as they exist now have no impact upon that. Minimum size, commercial minimum size was different along the coast. 11 inches, 12 inches, 13 inches up through New Jersey, 14 inches in New York and north. That was part of the 1980 to 1989 landings. That situation has changed now. So there are many reasons why the current allocation system, the data it's based upon, are no longer appropriate. And since all of the options included in the draft amendment are heavily based upon those, that's why New York needs these other considerations. Thank you.
I'm about ready to call the vote, and it looks like every hand that's gone up is someone who has already spoke. I know we could go around a second time. I just am being thoughtful about our time frame here, and it's hard to know whether there are any other issues that we're going to need to address this morning. That's why I'm being a little reluctant here to keep the discussion going, but I might try for another 5 minutes or so and ask everyone to keep their comments as brief as possible. But let me first go to Kylie.
Yeah, so to Mike's point about submitting additional options through public comment, I do just want to note, both for the Commission and the Council's process, if there are options submitted through public comment, the Council and Board can consider those. If they're substantially different from what is in the document now, we would most likely need to go out to a supplemental comment period again. And a general comment on the motion, and specifically this quota transfer, trying to understand what this means as staff. I think the current state shares are hardwired into both the Commission and the Council's FMPs and in the federal regulations. And if we're going to permanently or until future modifications change those, we need to have specific numbers that are going to go out to public comment. And putting the language like this out to public comment and then coming up with the permanent transfers after that might be a little problematic. So we're still trying to figure out exactly how this would work and when these numbers would come into play. Putting new shares into the amendment and into the federal regs might require a follow-up action, or if they're going to be done, might need to be just done through this action and figured out before the public comment process.
I certainly am feeling increasingly convinced that if this motion were to prevail, it would need to come back before this joint body for additional consideration. I just want to let you know from my perch here, I can't imagine going out to public hearing on something like this that has not yet been fully analyzed. And we've already heard from staff that that analysis will take some time. So without speaking to the merits, pro or con, but rather to the need to ensure that this document, which I think we all indicated right off the bat was so well developed, so comprehensive, so thorough, to just plug this in without that kind of associated thoroughness, to me would be a disservice. So again, without speaking to the merits of the proposal, but rather the time frame, my sense is that if this motion were to prevail, it would require us to reconvene at a later date and take up this issue and determine whether it's ready for inclusion in the document. That's just my opinion, but I just wanted to offer it at this time. Mike Bettany?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with your statement that, you know, if we're going to put something in the document, it needs to be very well identified. It needs to have a table, I think, like we see in the existing document that shows what the shares would be for each state. That's what the staff would need to do the analysis. But just in terms of timelines, I do want to suggest that the notion that we could go out to public hearing with the document as is, and if there was significant public comment on the types of approaches that Tony has outlined in this motion, the Council and the Commission could, at a later date, add those back in and go back out to public hearing. I think that would really be a substantial change to undermine the timeline. Earlier I mentioned that 3 to 4 month slip in completion of this action would not likely jeopardize being able to implement any new quotas for fishing year 2020. Given the requirements of the EIS process under NEPA that the Council's required to go through and we're required to go through, going back out to public hearing would almost certainly prevent us from having this action implemented prior to 2020. So we'd be looking at potentially a full year, 2021, before we could implement any new or changes to the quotas.
Thank you. Is there anyone other than Tom, Adam, and Emerson who would like to comment on this before I call the question? Lori? Anyone else? Nicola? Those 5, and then we're going to vote. Tom Foti.
I'm just commenting on Jim Gilmore's comment about that, the suffering, and it just cost a few points, and because we had the benefits. All of us took a hit when we started putting the plans in place. Matter of fact, the states with the biggest quota, which was basically the biggest landings at the time, took the biggest hit. And we've been working on rebuilding these stocks so we can see the benefit to those people over the years that have been suffering through what we've done here to actually reduce quotas that we didn't have in place 10 years ago. Took them big cuts from there. So we had more fishermen depending on those quotas. And to just say it's, well, matter-of-factly that was going on, we all took equal, on landings, took equal cuts, and I was here in 1990, Tony. I mean, before you were. So let's be honest here. I know what went on and the transfers that went on. A lot of that I agree with back then. But this is getting, I'll leave it at that. But all of us took equal cuts, and we also get punished every year more. My fishermen look at fish they got to throw back. They have short seasons. They have small quotas, and it affects more fishermen because we had bigger quota that depended on summer flounder for a living.
Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that it needs to be explicit that the public can comment on these two items. I don't want to go to public hearing, implying that people can comment on these if they wish to. Oftentimes the public thinks that they can just comment on specifically what's in the document. So I think this needs to be in there to get that public input. I had my hand up earlier when we were having the discussion about permanency. So I just want to go on the record that I realize that it's not going to be permanent, that it'll be in effect until there's another amendment addendum perhaps. But we don't want to go through this process every year. That's what we, as the original makers of the motion, had in mind. This is not going to be an annual renegotiation. And then let's take as much time as it takes to get this right. As we just heard from Mike Pentney, we do have some time. And our time is better spent including this in the public hearing document now, rather than putting it out for public hearing, getting some public comment, and then have to go through the process again. So let's include it. Let's hear what the public has to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Adam Nowalski.
So we heard the comment that none of these options work. Knowing what's on the agenda the rest of this week, I think that might be the theme of the week that we're dealing with here. And I certainly think it behooves us as a body to take every action we can in advance to develop options that will work for people. When I hear that comment that none of these options work, and then we're going to put another option in here which we ultimately may not vote in favor of implementation, what have we done other than delay whatever action that particular state intends to take, other than delay it for a couple years? Either these options are acceptable or they're not. And if they're not acceptable, then we either do, in my opinion, one of two things. Either we go ahead, send this document out as it is now, let those states that find the options unacceptable get the ball rolling on whatever it is that they're going to do. Let's not put it off for us to have another option in the document but ultimately not vote on it. All we've done is waste everybody's time, including the public at that point. Or if we as a body decide that these options are not going to work for everyone and we want to take action on that, then we hold the document back, go back to the drawing board. This sense of negotiating new state quota shares, maybe that's what we really need to do, is go back. And it's been great that we've had these very mathematical and thorough ways of describing how we're going to allocate. But if the goal is to negotiate new state quota shares, then let's just put them up on the board, send it back to the demersal committee, crossing things out, put some new numbers in until we find something that everybody can agree with. Otherwise, I feel like all we're doing at that point is just wasting everybody's time. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicola Mazur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In terms of negotiating new shares, it seems like a difficult enterprise unless it is based on one of the other options that's already in the document. So the way Jim Gilmore was explaining this, the need for this wording so that that could be part of the council outcome, I can get behind that. I know that's something that the commission has the ability to do, to modify the options and pick something in the middle at the final decision point. And I just wanted to also get on the record that if this does move forward, the negotiations would not have only New York on the receiving end, potentially, as has been discussed around the table. And then lastly, one question to staff about the coastwide quota option. If you could remind me kind of where we've been with the demersal committee developing these options. Was that something that was on the table and removed? I seem to remember there being a seasonal option, which is essentially a derivative of a coastwide quota. Thank you.
Kylie?
Yes, we did have discussions at the demersal committee and board subset about coastwide options that were essentially, quarterly, trimester, bi-monthly coastwide quotas, and those were taken out of the document pretty quickly.
Lori Nolan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It just seems, I mean, Adam touched on it, everyone's touching on it. If the document doesn't have an alternative in it that, we may as well just say it, satisfies New York, if by negotiating we could come up with the answer, it just seems a shame not to have it as part of the document when we go out to public hearing. And to sit here now and say New York is looking for 6.4% and they'll go away happy, that could be a better outcome for any state when you look at the alternatives in this document. By everybody giving up a little, you could end up with more than what you have in, say, the Scup model or some of these alternatives. So to not include it today, are we saying it can't be included unless we put numbers to what the new state allocations would be when it goes out to public hearing? We have to have the new lineup on what the allocations would be in order for this alternative to go out to the public and try to stay on a timeline? Or can it be somewhat vague at this point and just let it be known that it will be flushed out more thoroughly in the future, and that, as everyone's saying, it shouldn't be set in stone for the next 40 years? I mean...
Kylie?
Yeah, I think if it goes out to the public in a very vague form without actual proposed transfers, I mean, it's maybe more of a legal question, but I'm not sure how we could take final action on that and implement it without getting public comment on those numbers. And that may involve additional public comment periods, but I'll let Garfo answer that.
Mike Bettany?
So one possible outcome in relation to what Kylie just described is if the final numbers effectively are within the range of what's been or what has been analyzed in the document. So I'm just looking, for example, at Table 2B1. North Carolina is currently at 27.4%. 2B1 would have their allocation drop to 24.9. If under the scenario that Tony has described, the final outcome was North Carolina was somewhere within that range, 24.9 to 27.4, and that translated for all of the states, then presumably we could make the case under NEPA that because the impacts are within the range already considered, we would not need to go back out to public hearing. But I think we'd need to see, it's hard to make that draw that conclusion in advance of seeing what the actual numbers would be. So it's just if the outcome was within the range, and we may be able to make that reach that conclusion.
Yeah, Kylie.
Yeah, I think it's a possibility depending on the outcome, but I think the reason why we're sort of in this situation is because none of the range of outcomes in the current document is satisfying New York or comes close to that. I think we have had the conversation of, maybe we can modify one of the alternatives at final action, but none of the current alternatives have New York getting higher than, I think, 10%. So I think that was sort of why we're in this situation currently.
Okay, 1 minute caucus, and then I'm going to call for a vote. Everyone could take their seats. I'm going to preface the vote with make this sort of a conditional vote, and that is, if the vote were to prevail, this issue would need to be subject to further analysis and development by staff, and would need to come back before both bodies for review and approval. I've already been offered some suggested specification that might be appropriate specification to kind of lend further clarity to it, but I don't think it's appropriate here on the fly to try to figure out what that all is. I think it's something that could be developed over the next month or 2 or 3, and potentially by August we would have I guess 2 new options that would be potentially ready for consideration. So I just want to offer that as my suggestion that is the conditional basis for this vote, and that is, if it were to prevail, it would prevent the document, essentially prevent the document from going out to public hearing as is, and would require further development before it's brought back before both bodies. That's my sense. It seems to be consistent with everything I've heard from staff, from Garfo, and others, so that's going to be my suggestion. I'm not sure it's a ruling. It's a suggestion as to the implications of this vote. With that, I'm going to call the question. I'll ask Mike to call the question first on behalf of the council.
Can we get a roll call?
And we'll do that in the form of a roll call.
Kylie, do we have a list for roll call? I assume it's for both the council and the commission roll call?
Yes.
Sure, go ahead, Roy.
Mr. Chairman, having just heard your explanation of the implications of a positive vote for this motion, that kind of changes my mind. I would have liked your guidance in that before we went to caucus, because I may have an entirely different viewpoint as a result of what you just said. Thank you.
Well, I did offer it, and I frankly reiterated it, but I reiterated it perhaps with a little bit more certainty, and I appreciate your thought, Roy. But again, I don't think there's a point in recaucusing. I just think it's very clear to me, and again, based on everything I've heard from every side here, that if this were to prevail, it would require further analysis and development and have to come back before the board. So I do think that is the, and council, so that is the conditional basis for this vote on this issue. And I apologize if I didn't make that clear enough, but I did want to offer that before the vote. Granted, it's very close to the vote, but I want that to be on the record as my understanding of the implications of this outcome. Mike.
Let me ask members of the council, does the council want to do a roll call as well? No? No roll call on the council? No. It makes it a little easier since we have so many people around the table. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to read the motion, and then we'll take we'll vote as part of the council. So, move to include 2 additional options to the summer flounder draft amendment. 1, to negotiate new state quota shares. 2, to include coast-wide quota and management. Is the council ready for the question? All those council members in favor of the motion, please indicate by raising your hand. That's 6 in favor. All those opposed, same sign. That's 10 opposed. Any abstentions? Okay, seeing none, the motion fails for lack of a majority. Bob?
Thank you. So no need to take a board vote. The matter has essentially been nullified by the council's vote. So we're back to sort of square one in terms of looking for an overall motion on the package of issues and alternatives. Emerson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to offer the following motion, that we move to develop 2 additional options to the summer flounder draft amendment. 1, to negotiate new state quota shares. 2, to include coastwide quota and management.
Emerson, I'm sorry, that's the same motion, isn't it?
No, it's a different motion.
Can you explain your motion?
Yes, it's to develop 2 additional options. It's to take care of the background work that we need to do to include it in the public hearing document. Let's develop those 2 additional options.
Is there a second to that? And are you offering that on behalf of the board or the council?
Only on behalf of the board.
Thank you. I'm sorry. People should be wearing hats. I sometimes forget who's who. Okay. Is there a second to that motion on behalf of the board? Matt Gates seconds it. Is there a council member who would like to offer that? Steve Hines, is there a second by another member of the council? Lori Nolan. So we now have a new motion. I need clarification, though, on whether this motion is substantively different from the motion just voted on and its implications, and I'm going to have to turn to staff for their take on that. Bob Beal?
I'm not sure. Emerson, is the intent here to obviously have staff work on developing these options, but where does the sequencing go? In other words, the next question that's going to come before this board is, and the council, is the document ready to go out for public comment? So is the idea that the potential for the board and council to approve the document for public comment and the staff would be developing options for later consideration that will be added into the process somehow later?
Emerson?
Thank you. I'm taking my lead here and offering this motion, taking my lead from the chairman who voiced his opinion just before we took our vote, that we need to flesh this out a little bit and develop this option. And if it means delaying approving the final public hearing document until August, then so be it. But let's get this work done now. We have the time to do it now. Let's take care of it. And if it delays things by a couple of months, so be it. Let's get it right.
My sense is that this was inherent in the first vote, this notion of needing to develop, but I hear you, Emerson, and particularly given Roy's comment, I'm going to allow this to be subjected to another vote. I don't think there's a need for a whole lot of additional discussion unless anyone has a burning need to offer a thought. If not, I would like to call the question on this new version, if you will, of the, I'm sorry? Yeah, we'll okay. We're having some sidebars here in terms of the sequencing of the voting. So I think what we'll do is I'll just to be fair, we will alternate between board and council all day long. So regardless of the issue, it'll always switch back and forth, meaning we will first vote as a board on this motion, and then we will vote on a council. 30 seconds to caucus on this new motion, and then we'll vote on it. Okay, I'm going to call the question, and again, just for clarification, I'm essentially reiterating what I've said twice. I'm going to say it a third time. This would suspend all this. If this motion were to prevail, it would suspend all further discussion on the document for today. There's no point in continuing to deliberate on whether the document's ready to be approved for public comment. If this were to prevail, it would suspend that portion of our proceedings today and essentially end this agenda item. That's my sense. Is there anyone who has a different take on that? Adam?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just ask that additional discussion today be centered around what specific actions this body expects to take place to support this development. Is it back to the Demersal Committee? Is it back to the FMAC? Is it just staff bringing some things forward for another document for us to review at the next joint meeting? I think we would need clarification on that here today.
We'll cross that bridge if we come to it. Right now, I'm ready to call the vote for the board. Is the board ready to vote? If so...
Roll call, please.
Roll call. I'll have Kirby call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll go south to north on this. First, North Carolina.
No.
Commonwealth of Virginia.
No.
Potomac River Fisheries Commission.
No.
Maryland. Delaware.
Yes.
Can we just restate North Carolina's vote? You weren't on the mic.
Maryland's.
I'm sorry, Maryland's vote. You weren't on the mic. If Maryland could restate their vote. No.
Thank you. Delaware.
Yes.
New Jersey.
No.
New York.
Yes.
Connecticut.
Yes.
Rhode Island.
Yes.
Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Yes.
National Marine Fisheries Service.
Yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife? Absent.
The motion prevails 6-5 with no null votes and no abstentions to the council. Mike?
Is the council ready for the question? All those, Peter defer?
Yeah, point of order, is this, I'd like a ruling from the council that this is not the same motion that we voted on already.
The way that I understand this motion is that, as was stated by Bob, we essentially suspend all continued development, or we suspend action today on approving the document for the public comment, that was the plan, that was part of the timeline. If this were to pass, what we do next would be something that I'd need to speak with Chris about, and Bob and Tony and others to figure out, where we go from here. It was mentioned, does the demersal committee want to reconvene to discuss the issue? Do we just have staff develop a few options under number 1 and number 2 and just see what that looks like? I do agree that we're going to need to see this document again before it would go to the public, which would be maybe our August meeting, but with staff load working up specifications, I don't know if that's going to be the case. I can't speak for, we kind of need Chris here to speak to what staff have planned. I can look to Kylie to maybe provide some thought to the council about what her workload is leading up to our next joint meeting in August. But, Kylie, if you're not comfortable with speaking to that at this point, just let me know. Kylie?
Yeah, in my conversations with Chris, he's indicated essentially adding new options at this point, working them up to the level of public hearing document and draft EIS inclusion is going to take some time, and it's unlikely that we'd be able to do it in August, given all of our other priorities. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I think it's unlikely, and it partially depends on how much this option is developed by staff and how much it's provided to us if it has some work behind it from the folks that are proposing it.
Did that answer your question, Peter? Okay.
Roll call.
Okay, we'll do a council roll call. And I'm just going to go down my list in no particular order. Steve Hines?
Yes.
Laurie Nolan?
Yes.
Jim Gilmore?
John Maniscalco for Jim, yes.
You are also sitting for Maureen? Okay. Tony Delernia?
Yes.
Peter Hughes is absent. Adam Nowalski?
Yes.
Warren Elliott?
Yes.
Russ Babb?
No.
Andy Shields is absent. Stu Mickles?
No.
Wes Townsend? Wes is absent. Sonny Gwynn?
No.
Ward Slacum? Absent. Peter Defer?
No.
Roger Mann?
No.
Rob O'Reilly?
No.
Chris Batsavage?
No.
Dewey Hemmelwright?
No.
Sarah Winslow?
No.
Garfo?
Yes.
Okay, Okay, give me 1 second to tally. Okay, the vote was 7 in favor, 9 against. Motion fails. Bob?
Okay, so we are, I think, done with that issue. I can't imagine another way to skin that cat. So are there any other members of the board or council who would like to propose any other changes to the document? Substantive changes. Rob?
Seems a while, but I'm back to that situation with the NEFC FC trawl survey, and I can add one sentence, if I may, and it's after calculations were based on NEFC's spring and fall trawl survey catches. I would like to add, there are near coastal and state water surveys that also characterize the distribution and biomass of summer flounder. However, the only data sets with enough coverage in space and time to describe changes in geographic distribution of the stock over time. So that's for the NEFSC. So essentially, I have an additional sentence in there. I think the public, when you look at those two options of either a complete changeover, 13% north versus south, or a percent change, they would benefit from knowing that there's more than the Northeast Fisheries Science Center trawl survey characterizing summer flounder.
So two things. First of all, we all write fast, but I'm not sure anyone was writing, able to capture all that. So if you're able to provide that to staff, that would be helpful. Is there any objection to adding that language to the document? It's clarifying language as I take it. Is there any objection? Seeing none, that language will be added. Rob is providing it to staff to make sure that the record accurately reflects what he just read into it, or the document, I should say, accurately reflects what he just offered. Other changes, and I can go back to my notes. I think there were several folks. Rob, I had Lori Nolan indicating an interest in some language speaking to the derby fishing issue, essentially noting that there are existing and potential controls in place that would address that. And do you have anything more specific to that point, or does that cover it? And Kylie, are you comfortable with that suggestion that you could develop some language to regarding Lori's proposal?
Yes.
Thank you. Is there any objection to that proposal from Lori Nolan? Seeing none, that will be incorporated as well. Chris Batsevich, I think you had a suggestion, and I can't remember what it was, but do you want to reiterate it?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier I asked about for the federal latent permits to kind of get a sense of for the different sub-options where permits are lost, if that could be at the state level and have that in the public hearing document. And I guess I think it would be useful to have just so the public has a full understanding of the impacts. However, I know we're on a really tight schedule as far as trying to get this out and with the timeline that we have in front of us. So, and it's going to be in the EIS. So I guess I would say if it can be done and keep everything on schedule, it'd be great. But if not, then having it in the EIS is probably the best way to go. Thanks.
Kylie, are you comfortable with that suggestion?
Yes, we can talk to Garfo staff to figure out if that's feasible.
Thank you. Roger Mann, the 12-ounce issue. Very point well taken. I'm not sure exactly how to address it. I would offer you the floor again to speak to how you would like to see the document modified to reflect your concern.
I would leave the document as is at this point in time. It's not clear to me whether or not this particular use of numbers is enforced upon us by something that's already in federal regulation, in which case we can't change it. I've had a discussion with my colleague Pete Defer, and at some point perhaps we can have a more of a roundtable about the use of the appropriate use of significant numbers. I don't think it's appropriate to try and complete that before we do this. And indeed, I'm happy with this document, and when the point comes, I will forward a motion to accept as is and send it to public comment.
Thank you. And the last suggestion was from Tom Fody, who spoke to his interest in having the document reflect total numbers of fish in the north and south when we get into that north-south breakout issue. Kylie explained that right now exploitable biomass relates to exploitable biomass, which is fish over 14 inches in size. But Tom, you were speaking to your interest to include additional data on, I guess, the biomass as a whole, numbers of fish reflecting overall biomass on a north-south breakout. Is that correct?
Yeah, because back in the days when we basically set the recreational limits, they were on 12-inch fish, and we've moved that size up also. We should look at the total number of fish.
And so to Kylie, is that something that you feel that you can fold into the document?
That is something I would have to check with the Science Center staff, and I'm not exactly sure on how or where we would fold it in. I mean, right now what we have in the document is essentially 67% of the relative exploitable biomass was in the north during this time period and 80% in the second time period. We don't have poundage broken down in there by north and south, so I'm not totally clear on where it would fit in, but I can check with the Science Center on if that's feasible to do it in numbers of fish.
That's all I'm asking.
Thank you. So Kylie will follow up. With that, I think we had taken care of all the comments that I know of that were offered, and I appreciate those. I think it helped to improve the document. And at this point, Mike and I would be ready to entertain motions from both the council and the board that would seek to approve the draft summer flounder commercial issues amendment hearing document for public comment. Would anyone like to make a motion? Roger Mann, on behalf of the council.
On behalf of the council, a motion to accept the document as presented for distribution for public comment.
Is there a second to that from the council? Chris Patsevich. So moved and seconded by the council. We'll need a like motion from the board. Would any member of the board like to make that motion? Rob O'Reilly, and is there anyone from the board who would be interested in seconding the motion? John Clark. Moved and seconded by both the council and the board to approve the draft summer flounder commercial issues amendment hearing document for public comment. Any further discussion on the motion? This would be the final action of the day. No. Oh, I'm sorry, we have one more after this, but I guess on this issue it would be the final. David Borden?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. Since there's a potential for 400 permit holders to be eliminated, there's bound to be some concern about that. And is there a central source that those individuals can contact in order to figure out whether or not they meet the requirements under a particular alternative?
I was looking at Kylie. Kylie was looking at Garfo, and everyone's looking at everyone else. So. We're waiting as Garfo undertakes some sidebar discussions and hoping Mike might be able to offer something for the record.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, generally, individuals should contact us. We can provide landings history for their permit. However, we cannot provide necessarily all of the landing history associated with a set of permits because if those permits have changed hands over the years, and we don't have assigned authorization to release the prior owner's history, we cannot release it to the current owner unless and until we're actually making decisions as a result of final action by the council for a limited access program.
Eric Reed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question, a follow-up is if I ask for my permit history today, how long is it going to take me to get that? And that may affect our public hearing schedule if we want to go down that road.
Mike?
Yeah, I think to Eric's question, Eric, if you asked us today, we could probably get it relatively quickly. If 1,000 people ask us tomorrow, it's going to take us a while to get all of those responses out.
Okay, thank you. And Kirby was just reminding me that it's really to approve the draft summer flounder commercial issues amendment hearing document as modified today for public comment, to make it clear that those modifications that were offered on the record and accepted by both the board and council would be considered part of this motion. And is there any objection to that? And I think we might want to even amend the motion accordingly. Is there any objection to amending the motion by adding as modified today? Seeing no objection, the motion will be so modified, and that will be the motion that we will now vote on. Are there any further questions or comments before we call the vote? Hearing none, let's see, what order? I think we're back to council first.
Okay, for the council, move to approve the draft summer flounder commercial issues amendment hearing document for public comment as modified today. All those in favor, please indicate by raising your hand. That's 12 in favor. All those opposed? 4 opposed. Any abstentions? Seeing none, motion carries 12 to 4 to 0. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the board, those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Thank you. Those opposed, please raise your hand. Thank you. Any abstentions? Any no votes? The motion passes 9-2. No votes, no abstentions. So that completes the joint action on the public hearing document. We now need to quickly follow. I think this will be a quick follow. It's rather pro forma in its nature. The Commission, as noted earlier, needs to move forward with its own companion document. It's a draft amendment, and we do need a board vote on the draft amendment that would again be exactly the same in terms of issues, in terms of substance, issues and alternatives. It's just that it's a different document. And if anyone needs any further clarification, now would be the time to ask. Otherwise, I would be looking for a motion to approve the Commission's Summer Flounder Commercial Issues Amendment document for public hearing. Would any member of the board like to move? This is doing the same thing we just did, but on the board side. Moved by Rob O'Reilly, seconded by John Clark. Any discussion on the motion? Any need to caucus? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. This is board only. Thank you. Opposed? Abstentions? No votes. The motion passes 9-2. I'm sorry, Tony Kearns.
Just to get on record that this is a draft amendment, it's not a final document, and if we have the number, that would be good to add in there. There is no number. Okay. Cool. Thanks. It'll say draft amendment, commercial issues draft.
Okay, thank you. We're ready for lunch. We will break and reconvene. What time shall we reconvene? I need 1 hour. So we will reconvene at 1:21. We'll see you then. Have a good lunch. Thank you.